Welcome back, my dear students. Today I shall proceed with the remaining topics related to synapse. The first thing that I will like to discuss today is properties of synapse. There are different properties of synapses. By the word synapse, during my preceding discussion, I will mean chemical synapses if not otherwise specified. So the first property of synapse is its unidirectional conduction of impulses. Chemical synapses, as you can appreciate, will always convey signal unidirectionally because the synaptic vesicles containing the neurotransmitters are only located in the presynaptic neuron, while the postsynaptic neuron does not have any such vesicles with neurotransmitters. However, bidirectional transfer of signal is possible in electrical synapses. If you remember, electrical synapses are basically gap junctions intervening between the pre and postsynaptic neurons. As gap junctions do not have any choice of passage of ions, it's just a simple gateway. Hence, ions can pass from one neuron to the other depending on their concentration and electrical gradient. Hence, bidirectional transfer is possible in electrical synapses. However, that's an exception. As a rule, all synapses are unidirectional in nature. The second property of a synapse is known as the synaptic delay. What is a synaptic delay? It is the time taken by an impulse to cross one synapse. Means the time taken by the impulse to cross the synaptic cleft and reach the postsynaptic membrane. It is about 0.5 millisecond. Why is it important? Because this time factor has to be taken into consideration while we do the nerve conduction velocity studies. The next property of a synapse is excitatory postsynaptic potential, or EPSP. This particular topic is very important for undergraduate students, both for Viva as well as theory. So what is an excitatory postsynaptic potential? The definition is evident from the name. Let's break down the name one by one. It is excitatory postsynaptic potential. Means there is a potential difference in the postsynaptic membrane which is excitatory for the postsynaptic neuron. Again, I am repeating. It is a potential difference of the postsynaptic membrane which is excitatory to the postsynaptic neuron. Now, let's try to describe it. What happens? When neurotransmitters like glutamate and acetylcholine are released from the presynaptic neuron, they bind to their specific receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. Near the areas of the receptors, localized depolarizations occur because these neurotransmitters mostly open up cation channels, resulting in influx of sodium and slight efflux of potassium, but the sodium influx always outsmarts the potassium efflux. So the net result is an influx of cations inside the postsynaptic neuron, resulting in localized areas of depolarization. So what happens next is the membrane potential of those areas reach closer to the threshold voltage for an action potential to materialize. Thus, these postsynaptic potentials are potentially excitative. An individual EPSP is not strong enough to produce an action potential. Only when many EPSPs are generated on a neuron within fractions of milliseconds of each other can an action potential occur. Hence, there is the potential of the EPSPs to be added up. That is why they are all known as graded depolarizations. The magnitude of a single EPSP can range from fractions of millivolts to about 8 millivolt. Typically, the EPSPs last for 10 to 20 milliseconds and thereafter they decay. In this time period, if they do not add up to reach the threshold potential, action potential will not be generated. EPSPs can again be a fast EPSP as well as a slow EPSP. A fast EPSP is generated when the neurotransmitters bind to such receptors which are coupled to ionotropic channels. Means the ligand binding opens up ion channels which results in influx of cations into the postsynaptic neuron. This type of EPSP are very fast in onset and are of lesser duration in terms of lasting and are thus known as fast EPSPs. An example of fast EPSP occurring is when acetylcholine binds to its nicotinic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, they produced fast EPSPs. Next is slow EPSP. When neurotransmitters exert their effect via metabotropic receptors, means the receptors which are G protein coupled 7 transmembrane serpentine receptors. When the neurotransmitters bind to such receptors, they produce EPSPs, means they will produce graded depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane, but their onset will be much slower compared to the fast EPSPs and they will be much longer lasting compared to the fast EPSPs. Example is again acetylcholine acting through its muscarinic receptors produce slow EPSPs. The next property of a synapse is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Just like an excitatory postsynaptic potential, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential is also a localized, graded change in the potential difference across the postsynaptic membrane. But here the change is more towards the negative side, means the resting potential of the postsynaptic membrane is pushed down more towards negative side, or in other words, it is hyperpolarized. That causes the membrane to become refractory to further excitation. How can such a phenomena occur? Certain neurotransmitters are there like GABA and glycine, which on binding to their receptors on the postsynaptic membrane opens chloride channels. The GABA, acting through its GABA A receptors, does so. This leads to the tendency of production of a localized hyperpolarization, because chloride, being a negative ion, will try to enter into the cell, because chloride is much more outside the cell compared to the inside, and an influx of a negative ion will push the potential more towards the negative side, which will decrease the probability of an action potential occurring. Alternatively, inhibitory postsynaptic potential can also occur if the conductance of potassium ions across the cell membrane is increased, resulting in its efflux and subsequent hyperpolarization. GABA, acting through GABA B receptors, produces such IPSPs. Now, postsynaptic potentials, which are IPSPs, are otherwise of same properties just like the EPSPs. That is, they are graded, they needs to be added up, then only they can be strong enough to stop a action potential from occurring. The next property of a synapse is presynaptic inhibition. This is again an important topic for all of you, both for Viva as well as theory exam. It can come as a short note. Now, what is presynaptic inhibition? When a presynaptic neuron of a synapse is inhibited to release neurotransmitter, even when an action potential reaches it, the phenomena is known as presynaptic inhibition. How can it occur? It occurs when a third neuron ends on the presynaptic neuron, forming an axo-axonic synapse. So from here, you can also answer a Viva question where you can find an axonic synapse. You can say where there is presynaptic inhibition, we find an axo-axonic synapse. Now, the basic mechanism of presynaptic inhibition is hyperpolarization of the presynaptic membrane by the third neuron. Means the presynaptic membrane is already hyperpolarized. When the action potential reaches it, the action potential finds the membrane of the presynaptic neuron very refractory. So the action potential has to work hard to cause a depolarization, and as you can remember, a depolarization is needed for the voltage gated calcium channels to open up. How this presynaptic inhibition occurs? It is simple. Again, just like IPSPs, it is achieved by increasing the chloride conductance of the presynaptic membrane due to activation of GABA A receptors, or potassium efflux due to activation of the GABA B receptors. Both mechanisms will lead to less entry of calcium and consequent less or no neurotransmitter release from the presynaptic neuron. Hence, it is known as a presynaptic inhibition. This diagram tries to demonstrate the phenomena of presynaptic inhibition. Here, the yellow neuron is the presynaptic neuron. The purple one is the postsynaptic neuron. While there is a third neuron, the green one, which is causing the presynaptic inhibition by forming a axo-axonic synapse with the presynaptic yellow neuron. You can see action potential. The red arrows are traveling down the presynaptic neuron, It is causing calcium influx by opening up the calcium channels which are voltage gated normally. But before this action potential arrives, if another action potential had arrived on the green neuron which had GABA as its neurotransmitter, it will cause GABA release in the synaptic cleft of the axoaxonic synapse between the presynaptic and the third neuron. This GABA will cause its effect by either increasing the chloride entry or potassium exit from the presynaptic membrane. So the presynaptic membrane potential will be further lower than what it should have been in the resting state. So when the action potential arrives from above in the presynaptic neuron, it will find that it is harder to push the membrane potential up to values of -40 to -20 millivolt, which is required to open up the calcium channels. So less calcium will enter the presynaptic neuron, less neurotransmitter will be released, and there will be reduced effect on the postsynaptic membrane. Just like a presynaptic inhibition, there can also be a presynaptic facilitation. Means the presynaptic membrane is already made ready to fire before the action potential arrives. How can that be possible? Here again, a third neuron forms an axoaxonic synapse with the presynaptic neuron, but the third neuron here usually releases the neurotransmitter serotonin. Release of serotonin mediates inactivation of the potassium channels on the presynaptic membrane by phosphorylating them by the cyclic AMP pathway. Now, if you remember, potassium always tries to go out of the cell. There are always few potassium channels which are open, and potassium constantly leaks out of a cell in small amounts. But this inactivation stops these small leakages too. What happens is the positive ion concentration in the presynaptic neuron is then high because the potassium has stopped leaking. So basically the resting potential of the presynaptic membrane is already pushed up by the third neuron, which is releasing serotonin. Hence, when the action potential arrives from above, it finds the membrane already slightly depolarized. So it can cause its depolarization much quicker and also for much longer periods. Hence, more calcium ion enter the presynaptic membrane and it causes more release of neurotransmitter and increased effect of the postsynaptic membrane. After presynaptic inhibition and facilitation, now it's time for the postsynaptic counterpart. Means postsynaptic inhibition, which is the next property of a synapse which I shall be discussing. As the name suggests, postsynaptic inhibition is an inhibition of the postsynaptic neuron resulting in failure of synaptic transmission even when the presynaptic neuron is firing. So how can postsynaptic inhibition take place? It can occur by three definite mechanisms. The first one is a Renshaw cell inhibition or inhibition by negative feedback. The second mechanism is inhibition by reciprocal innervation, and the third mechanism is known as feed-forward inhibition. Renshaw cell inhibition. This is the first variety of postsynaptic inhibition. What is a Renshaw cell? A Renshaw cell is a neuron. It is designated as an interneuron as it lies within neurons. Where does it lie? They are found in the gray matter of the spinal cord. From the diagram, you can see there are two large neurons, and intervening between them there is a small neuron which is designated as the Renshaw cell. The peculiarity of these Renshaw cells are they have glycine as their neurotransmitter. That is, they will produce IPSPs in the synapses they make. Now from the diagram you can see there's two large neurons. They are the alpha motor neurons. Means the motor neurons that supply our skeletal muscles. These alpha motor neurons are usually arranged in pools. Means the alpha motor neurons supplying a particular muscle group are arranged closely. These Renshaw cells intervene between alpha motor neuron pools. When an alpha motor neuron fires, means it gives an excitatory output through its axon, it will ultimately reach the muscle and there will be muscle contraction. But at the same time, it gives collaterals to the Renshaw cells. These Renshaw cells thereafter sends their axons back to the cell bodies of the axon which sent it the collateral as well as surrounding axons of the same motor pool. This type of synapse it forms with the alpha motor neurons results in formation of IPSPs in the alpha motor neurons which were firing to cause the muscle contraction. So when the next excitatory input reaches the alpha motor neurons, due to the Renshaw cell activity, the action potential might get blocked because the Renshaw cell with its glycine as neurotransmitter has caused inhibition of the alpha motor neuron. So this is an example of a postsynaptic inhibition where the presynaptic neuron which is coming from the higher centers are failing to excite the alpha motor neurons which are the postsynaptic neurons because of the presence of the Renshaw cell. This is known as the Renshaw cell inhibition. Now how does it help in the body? It actually helps in modulating alpha motor neuron discharge. If alpha motor neuron discharge would have continued unabated, we might have been having tetanic contractions of our skeletal muscles, which is undesirable. These Renshaw cells makes the alpha motor neurons refractory to further stimulation for short durations of time, which gives the muscles the time to recover for the next contraction. Actually, the clinical importance of Renshaw cell is highlighted by the disease tetanus, in which the toxin of tetanus produced by the bacterium Clostridium tetani inhibits the Renshaw cell, and this inhibition disinhibits the alpha motor neurons and they continuously fire, giving rise to the clinical manifestations of the disease tetanus. The next example of postsynaptic inhibition is inhibition by reciprocal innervation. The most common example of such inhibition by reciprocal innervation is the muscle stretch reflex. In the diagram, you can see there are two groups of muscles shown. One is the extensor group and one is the flexor group. In the stretch reflex, when the tendon of one group of muscle is tapped, gently, it causes a stretch in that group of muscle that leads to the contraction of that group, while at the same time there is a relaxation of the other group. Means the agonist muscle contracts and its antagonist muscles relaxes. How is that achieved? That is achieved by the phenomena of reciprocal innervation. From the diagram you can see there is a patellar hammer which is being used to stretch the tendon of the extensor group of muscle. Whenever there is a stretch, the sensory fibers from the muscle spindles send signals to the dorsal root ganglion on the dorsal side of the spinal cord. This dorsal root ganglion thereafter gives its axons to the alpha motor neurons of many muscles. One of those is the one which innervates the extensor group, while the other is the one which gives to innervation to the flexor group. The extensor group alpha motor neuron is supplied directly by the dorsal root ganglion. Hence, the output is excitatory. The alpha motor neuron is excited and it causes contraction of the extensor group of muscle. But to the flexor group of muscle, the dorsal root ganglion does not give direct supply. It gives supply through an inhibitory interneuron. So, the dorsal root ganglion firing actually causes inhibition of the alpha motor neuron which supplies the flexor group. Hence, the flexor group of muscles do not contract. If at the same time from any other higher center a excitatory input had arrived to the alpha motor neuron of the flexor group, it would have found the flexor group alpha motor neuron refractory to its excitation because the dorsal root ganglion has made it refractory for it to be excited. Hence, the postsynaptic neuron, which is the alpha motor neuron to the flexor group, is inhibited by the reciprocal innervation of the dorsal root ganglion. That is why this is an example of a postsynaptic inhibition where the presynaptic neuron is the higher center motor neuron coming from the brain or the brain stem, while the postsynaptic neuron is the alpha motor neuron to the flexor group, and it is inhibited by the reciprocal innervation by the dorsal root. So this is an example of a postsynaptic inhibition by reciprocal innervation. The third variety of postsynaptic inhibition is a feed-forward inhibition. Such inhibition is commonly seen in the cerebellar cortex. The cerebellar cortex is unique in having different types of neurons which are having peculiar names like basket cells, Purkinje cells, Golgi cells, and also axons which are having peculiar names themselves like mossy fibers and climbing fibers. You shall learn the details of them when you study cerebellum in detail. Here I am not going to go into the detail. Here in the diagram you can see there are representative cells of the cerebellar cortex. Now on the left hand side, as a comparative study is given the example of a feedback inhibition, and as on the right hand side you can see feed forward inhibition. On the feed forward side, what is peculiar is there are two inputs to two different neurons, the purple neuron and the black neuron. The inputs, both of them are excitatory. So basically these inputs will cause excitation of both the neurons. Now there is another input received by the black neuron from the purple neuron which is inhibitory in nature. So excitation of the purple neuron will cause inhibition of the black neuron. Here, the black neuron does not excite the purple neuron. It has nothing to do with the purple neuron. Yet, it is getting inhibited by the purple neuron because of the same excitation which it received from another source. This is an example of a feed-forward inhibition. Means the forward movement of the excitatory impulse has first caused an excitation in both the neurons, and thereafter, due to a presence of an inhibitory neuron, there is inhibition of one neuron. Hence, also this is an example of a postsynaptic type of inhibition. Here the presynaptic neuron is the one which is giving input from outside. See the two black positive lines, that is the presynaptic neuron, while the postsynaptic neuron is the black neuron. On the left hand side is an example of the feedback inhibition, where the neuron's own firing causes its own inhibition. That is the difference between a feed forward and a feedback inhibition. In feed forward inhibition, the neuron which gets inhibited does not cause excitation of the inhibitory neuron itself. These were the three examples of postsynaptic inhibition: the Renshaw cell inhibition, the inhibition by reciprocal innervation, and the feed-forward inhibition. The next property of synapse is its convergence and divergence. From the diagram, you can easily appreciate what convergence and divergence means. Convergence is said to exist when more than one axon terminal of different neurons synapses with one postsynaptic neuron, while divergence is just the opposite, means that different axon terminals of a single neuron is synapsing with different postsynaptic neurons. So convergence helps in collection of signals, while divergence helps in distribution of signals. The next three properties of synapses, namely summation, occlusion, and subliminal fringe, are important for viva as well as theory exam. The first property is that of summation. As the name suggests, it means adding up of signals. How is it seen in context of a synapse? When many presynaptic neurons converge on a single postsynaptic neuron, that is, there is convergence, as I have discussed just earlier. Each of these neurons, means the presynaptic neurons, might produce an EPSP in the postsynaptic neuron, which by themselves are not strong enough to produce an action potential. But when generated at the same time, all of them, they summate to result in an action potential of the postsynaptic neuron. This type of summation, resulting in the production of an action potential, is known as a spatial summation. Means spatial summation requires convergence. Another variety of summation can be seen in context of a synapse, that is known as a temporal summation. Means summation with respect to time. Here only a single presynaptic neuron will transmit to the postsynaptic neuron. The individual EPSPs might be weak, but since it transmits rapid repeated impulses, they add up because they are occurring individually within the time of the decay of their previous one. This type of adding up might lead to the formation of an action potential, and such summation is known as a temporal summation. These two diagrams tries to demonstrate the phenomena of spatial and temporal summation. In the first one, you can see there is convergence of inputs. They fire at the same time, though their individual EPSPs are of smaller magnitude. They add up and ultimately there is an action potential in the initial segment of the postsynaptic neuron. In the second diagram, there are repeated impulses arriving from a single presynaptic neuron and they add up in the postsynaptic neuron to give an action potential in the initial segment. These are the examples of spatial and temporal summation. The next property, as I had said, is occlusion. Now, what is occlusion? When a presynaptic neuron has a divergent axon termination, that is, it will transmit its impulses to a number of neurons on which it terminates. Similarly, another presynaptic neuron might have a similar divergent termination. Now, if these two neurons share a few terminations due to the phenomenon of convergence, the sum of the total number of postsynaptic neurons which fire when the two presynaptic neurons are simultaneously stimulated will be less than when these presynaptic neurons are individually stimulated. This phenomena is known as occlusion in synaptic transmission. I am repeating. One neuron is showing divergence. Say it is supplying to 10 other neurons. While another second neuron is also showing divergence and supplying to 10 other neurons. Now, of these 10 neurons which the first supplies and the 10 the other two supplies, 5 are common. Means actually the two neurons had supplied to 15 postsynaptic targets instead of 20. Now when these two presynaptic neurons are stimulated simultaneously, there will be 15 postsynaptic outputs instead of 20. The loss of these 5 is known as the phenomena of occlusion. As I was saying, this diagram tries to demonstrate what I was just saying. Here you see there are two presynaptic neurons A and B. A has 10 divergent outputs. B also has 10 divergent outputs. But they share 5 outputs among themselves. So when they two fire simultaneously, there will be 15 outputs rather than 20 due to this phenomena of occlusion. The third phenomena or property is the phenomena of subliminal fringe. To understand it, we have to go back to the diagram of occlusion. There we had two neurons which are having divergent output and they share 5 of their outputs while the other 5 are unshared. Now, if it happens that those two presynaptic neurons which share their output send out subthreshold EPSPs, what will happen is the shared postsynaptic neurons might fire because of the phenomena of spatial summation, while the non-shared neurons will not fire. Means 5 of the postsynaptic neurons will fire while the 10 will not fire. The 10 which does not fire will have their membrane potential slightly raised or their threshold for firing will be lowered because of the sub-threshold EPSPs it is receiving. Hence, they are known to be or designated to be in the subliminal fringe of the shared neurons. Means their activity is in the fringe region, a little push from somewhere else will also cause them to fire. This is known as the phenomena of subliminal fringe. The last property of synapse which I am going to discuss is synaptic plasticity. Synaptic plasticity is a very complicated topic, not important for undergraduate level. However, you should have a basic idea. What is synaptic plasticity? It is a phenomena in which synaptic transmission can become stronger or weaker over a period of time following previous changes in discharge pattern in that synapse. It is commonly seen in the areas of the central nervous system involved in learning and memory, like the hippocampus, the nucleus basalis of Maynard, the cornu-ammonis neurons, etc. Now, synaptic plasticity can occur by different mechanisms like post-tetanic potentiation, habituation, sensitization, long-term potentiation, and long-term depression. All these mechanisms involve the glutamate receptors NMDA and AMPA and change in the calcium ion concentrations in the postsynaptic neuron. Further discussion on these mechanisms is not required for undergraduate level. If you have queries on these phenomena while you go through your textbooks, you can ask me personally. I will answer them to the best of my knowledge. However, prolonged discussion on these topics is not required. This ends my discussion on synapse and its properties. Thank you.